This is another reason why the scapegoat cannot represent Jesus, but absolutely represents Satan. Let's eat. The expression blood on your head is an idiom that means to be guilty for or responsible for someone's death. For example, the two spies were sent by Joshua to spy out Jericho, the city. They meet up with Rahab, and Rahab shows them kindness. In return, she asks them to protect her family, make sure they don't come and hurt her or any of her family when Israel comes in, when Israelite soldiers comes in and destroy the city of Jericho. They promise her safety and protection. Now, they said in Joshua 2:19, if any of them, any of Rahab's family, goes outside her house into the street, their blood will be on their own heads. We will not be responsible, is what these two spies said. As for those who are in the house with you, their blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on them. Here's the warning: stay inside the house when Israel comes and destroys the city. Stay in the house. If you come out of the house and you get caught in the crossfire, you are responsible for your death. But if you stay in the house and anyone comes into the house and hurts anyone, we will be responsible for your family's death. Their blood will be on our head. Another example is in 2 Samuel chapter 1, where a young Amalekite soldier killed Saul, the king, the anointed of the Lord, as David calls it. Then he goes and tells David that he killed King Saul. Of course, David was not happy about it. And then David comes to this young man and David tells his soldier, this is what David said to his soldier. He called one of his men and said, go and strike him down. Strike down this young Amalekite soldier. So he struck him down and he died. Verse 16, for David had said to him, your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, I killed the Lord's anointed. That young Amalekite soldier was responsible or guilty for the death of King Saul, the Lord's anointed. And here's another example found in the New Testament where you found that this idiom, blood on your head, is found in chapter 18 of the book of Acts. Paul is preaching the message of Jesus as the Messiah. He's trying to convince the Jewish leaders that Jesus is the Messiah, the promised Christ. And the Jews rejected Paul's message. And Paul, of course, was not happy about it. And this is what Acts 18 verse 5 and 6 tells us. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Paul is telling them, you're responsible for your own curse. I told you that Christ is the Messiah. I did my part, and you did not receive the message. So whatever curse comes upon you, that is your response. You are guilty for your own demise. So I repeat, the expression blood on his own head is an idiom that means to be guilty for or responsible for the death of someone, either yourself or someone else's. This concept also applies to the idiom blood on your hand. For example, in the book of Genesis, Cain killed his brother Abel. He is guilty for the death of Abel, responsible for the death of Abel. And God is speaking to Cain in Genesis 4, verse 11. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. You are responsible for the death of your brother. Cain, you are guilty for the death of Abel. And in the book of Isaiah, the Israelites, guilty of murder. This is Isaiah 59, verse 3. For your hands are stained with blood, bloody hands, your fingers with guilt. Guilty for murder. One more example in the book of Matthew, chapter 27. This is where Pilate now is judging Jesus. Pilate sees that Jesus is innocent, not a criminal, not guilty of any crime. So now Pilate washes his hands. Here in verse 24, when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. No blood on my hands, is what Pilate was saying. I am innocent of this man's blood, he said. It is your responsibility. So blood on your hands means guilty for, to be guilty for, or responsible for the death of someone else. So the two expressions, the two idioms, blood on your head and blood on your hands, they both mean the same thing. They both mean to be guilty for or responsible for a death, either your death or someone else's death. In the daily sacrifice, the sinner has blood on his hands. The sinner have bloody hands. He lay his hand on the head of the sacrificial animal, which represents transference of his guilt, his sins, from himself, from the sinner, to the sin offering. Then the sinner himself, not the priest, the sinner, takes the blade and slaughters the animal. Therefore, blood on his hand. He is guilty for the death of the sacrificial animal. He is responsible for the death of someone else, the animal in this case. So that is what takes place every day during the daily sacrifices. Sinners have bloody hands, but on the Day of Atonement, one of the goats have blood on his head. On the Day of Atonement, the blood of the Lord's goat was placed on the head of the scapegoat. That means something. That significantly means something. On this day, the high priest carried the blood from the Lord's goat or the sin offering and sprinkled it inside the tent of the sanctuary and on the altar of sacrifice. But wait a minute, pause. The high priest have blood on his hands? Does that mean he is responsible or guilty for the death of the Lord's goat? No, that's not what it means. The blood was not sin-laden. It was not laden with sin, or it did not carry sin. How do I know that? No hand was placed on the head of the sin offering, meaning there was no transference of sin from the sinner to the sin offering. That would not make sense because the high priest represents Jesus. Jesus, the sinless one, the sinless priest. This blood that did not carry sin was used to purify or cleanse the sanctuary. The blood of the Lord's goat was placed on the head of the scapegoat. There was blood on the priest's hand. The high priest had blood on his hands, and this blood came from the Lord's goat. He sprinkles inside the tent. He sprinkles on the altar of sacrifice, and nowhere in Leviticus 16 where it's mentioned that the high priest washed his hands before he placed his hands on the head of the scapegoat. Therefore, there was blood on the head of the scapegoat. This represents then that the scapegoat is guilty or responsible for someone's death. The Lord's goat. Satan is guilty or responsible for the death of Christ on the cross. Satan is guilty. Satan is responsible for the sin of Adam and Eve. He led Eve to take the fruit from the tree. He tempted Eve and was successful. And with the fall of man, sin entered into the world and death came with it. Satan is guilty for the death of God's people. Satan have blood on his hands, and Satan will have blood on his head. Satan is the guilty party in the Day of Atonement. That is what is being represented in the ritual of the scapegoat. The dragon is angry with the woman, and he went to make war with those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Satan have bloody hands, and he will have bloody hands again in the last days, for he will persecute God's people. But in the end, at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan will have blood on his head. He will be put to death, and he will cease to exist along with sin and all wickedness. So put in the comments what you think, and questions, comments, whatever. Hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell, and see you on the next one. Peace and God bless.